Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who's come down to Dev Game Club Studios for a run-through.
Tim Longo.
That was one of my favorite lines the whole thing. Oh yeah, just go ahead and cough to death there.
Yeah, you just threw me off there. I don't want to go to that run through. You can't make me because I know it's going to happen.
That was a great laugh I had at the time when that line was like, "Oh, that's perfect." Yeah, that was the Lenny Briscoe turns to the camera moment of the Phoenix Wright episode that we played this week.
Yes. Nice. Yeah. The samurai, what's it called? The
Turnabout Samurai.
Turnabout Samurai. Yeah. So right off the bat for the Phoenix Wright, you already said that.
Actually, I have a correction from last week I want to issue that nobody called me on. Probably.
Wow.
Yes, I caught myself. Well, it's actually two things. One is, and we should have noted this at the time, but Portopia serial murder case that we talked about.
Yeah.
I went and looked into that because I was like, is this the one? Because I was like, I'm not sure this is the one I was thinking of. And it wasn't. So that's part two of the correction. But one of the things we should have said is that Yuji Horii, who created Dragon Quest and wrote Chrono Trigger, was the originator of the visual novel. That was his game.
Oh, holy cow.
It was his second game. He had a tennis game that he had done basically to win a contest to win a job at Enix. So that's kind of a big miss.
That's huge. Yeah. I did not connect that. I didn't look at who was involved. Yeah.
It was only because I was trying to track down, because I went and I was like, God, that name didn't sound super familiar when you said it. The Portopia made me think it was maybe what I was thinking of. The game I was actually thinking of was a game called, and it's much later, it's in the 90s, called YUNO, YUNO, hyphenated, A Girl Who Chants Love at the Bound of This World, which is one of the more Baroque titles that I've come to associate with visual novels. Portopia was not itself supernatural. It was pretty much a straightforward detective case sort of thing.
I see.
But this is the one that I was like, I think this is the one, and it had parallel universes and like some time travel stuff, I think. But yeah, I wanted to correct the record, as it were, on that. I'm reissuing my statement about these early games to clarify my testimony. So.
Okay.
Anyway.
Well, let's get into cross-examination then, and I will see if you can
trip me up,
knock something out of you.
You're gonna press me.
I'm gonna press. Yep. Keep pressing. Why do you? I mean, there's never been a time when I haven't, when you couldn't, or when you shouldn't press. I feel like every time they ask you, do you want to press? I always press, and it's what you want to do.
I think there is a time in this one where you can press about, I think you can press about whether, I don't think it costs you, but the judge kind of gives you a hard time. And I don't know if there's anything mechanically with that. I think there was a point at which it was clear they couldn't have gone from Studio 2 to Studio 1 because the path was blocked. And I could press her, the final witness, more on that, but I didn't because I did once because I was like, is this going to give me a hard time? And it did. It was like, well, come on, that doesn't, you already know that, and
maybe I did that too.
Edgeworth gave me a hard time, yeah.
It
didn't cost anything. There was no no metric cost or anything like that of possible failure. It was just embarrassing, or whatever. So
right. Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, I was kind of expecting there to be an example with the kid, for instance, right? That that would be a situation that maybe you could see them say, and in fact, they multiple times say, don't be too aggressive with the kid because he's a kid kind of thing, and
right.
So in my designer brain, I was like, oh, we're going to have to handle this witness differently because he's a kid. And so that would kind of bring out some new sort of tactics. But then no, it ultimately just ended up no, he's a kid, and you just gotta question him,
especially this kid, because he's a liar.
Because he's a yeah. So it's like
because he has no respect for the law. That kid.
Yeah, right. And
I
adults.
hope that kid turns back up in the third game.
Oh right,
as a killer.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah. So why don't you? What's the quick version of what this theme or the subject of this one is for those who maybe aren't playing?
You're right. For those who aren't playing online. Okay. So yes, as you already heard, there was a run through down at the studio, which means that there was a murder at the beginning. In this case, the structure changed a little bit because we don't actually know who the killer is.
Right.
And so I thought, oh, maybe this is how they increase difficulty, is that they give us less information to guide us less in the case towards who we should be pressing or what have you. Not really, I wouldn't say, but anyway. One actor is found dead in the studio where he was normally filmed on a futuristic samurai show. And another actor has been arrested, the hero of the show, because only he could have done it, presumably. He claims to have been asleep at the time. Your sidekick, Maya says, right. You're right. Yeah, sorry. There's a little confusion with that because, of course, she changes sometimes into Mia. Maya is a fan of the show and of these kinds of shows generally. And she basically presses Phoenix into taking the case, and so he does. And so a lot of it centers around this particular location of going back and forth to this and around and inside this studio, location and lot and the employee area and all this stuff. So we'll kind of get into all of that, but that's kind of the main setup is the hero of the show who everybody loves, who looks nothing like a samurai. In fact, he looks more like Logan. Looks like Wolverine.
Yeah, my first note was Wolverine.
Yeah,
exclamation point.
he's super hairy and he's got the big sideburns and everything. And he's shaped like that. So I was like, oh, that's a weird choice.
I'm sure.
But yeah, he's
influenced. Yeah.
Oh, clearly. But he's I was surprised his name wasn't straight up Logan. But he's the sheepish actor hero, who clearly the guy's too nice to have been the killer. And so you go and you start meeting all the weird characters down at the movie studio or TV studio, I really should say.
There was a full sort of phase, maybe one whole day in the structure of the game where I thought actually they were going to switcheroo on us and that he actually did do it.
Yep. Yeah, there was for me as well.
Yeah, where I was like, oh, maybe this is one of those. I wonder if they ever do that in the series.
Maybe Phoenix is going to grow up here a little bit and realize that not everybody he defends is innocent.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Breaking that sort of altruistic sort of feel to the defense side of the argument so far, at least. Yeah. So, I mean, it was, I did appreciate this setting, sort of the backdrop of this one, because it definitely was different, and there was a lot of different interesting things happening with just the TV studio and, and the different key players in it, and Maya's sort of infatuation with the show, which was kind of neat, so it seems like it must be, I would assume, sort of a tenet of the franchise, in that every case there typically seems so far to have somebody involved in the case has a personal sort of interest in it, a stake, whether obviously in the first two cases it was very direct, and in this one it's just more of an understanding of the subject matter, or an interest in the subject matter as a fan. But I think that's kind of neat, because it just it's not just, you're not just doing a job, right? And you're not just kind of taking on a random client that comes through the door, but it kind of comes to across your desk in a different way. So that's kind of neat.
And it's very in keeping with both television shows that surround these sorts of themes, detecting and whatever. It's always somebody that usually there's some introductory thing that's like, oh, this is the brother of, or the whatever. And that's true of also book series. It's like all these characters become basically feeding grounds for for why cases are happening. Like, oh, I was visiting my brother-in-law and stumbled across a murder. Unless you're Angela Lansbury's character in Murder, She Wrote, in which case, of course, she's the killer. She's just really, really good at covering her tracks.
Wait, that's not how that show goes.
I mean, in my head canon, it is.
Okay, are you? I was like, it's been a while for me, and my wife talks about that show all the time. So
it's set in Maine, so I think it can go. It could go either way,
right? So. But filmed in Mendocino, California, which
I'm well aware. I have stayed in that house.
Nice, excellent. Well, now that we're talking about an '80s TV show with Angela Lansbury,
yes,
yeah, Anyway. But a detective nonetheless, so it's not too far off, because I think we'll talk a lot about detectives in this episode. And then I think the one of the macro sort of notes I have down that I wanted to mention for this episode that I really ended up appreciating even more so this time was just the sense of there were a lot of twists and turns in this one, and I don't think, to be honest, from a game logic perspective, they were all very fair, which I think we'll get to later. But putting that aside for a second, I did really, the sense of building a case layer by layer, kind of like day by day and moment by moment, and evidence by evidence piece was really cool in this one, and I feel like it's really showing, for the most part, with the exception of a couple other sort of mechanical things we'll talk about that weren't great. I think it really shows why people like this franchise, and probably why it's a pretty good example of a visual novel, because it's such a good conceit for layering mystery and story, over multiple sort of scenes, if you will, if you see each day as sort of like a series of scenes. And I just felt, I felt like we were chipping away, and kind of got a little bit of this. And I got some of that in the previous two episodes, but this one felt like the meaty example, right? And I'm sure the last one will play as similar.
I mean, there was a lot less of it in the first one. You mentioned this one has a lot of twists and turns in it, and that's definitely true, because in the first case is very straightforward. The second case is there's really just the office and the hotel across the street. There's really not a lot there in terms of like additional evidence and even characters. There's not a ton of, so it's there's not a lot to build from, and it, that's the first full case, and it's totally reasonable to me that would be the case. I also found this a lot more compelling from a sort of detective standpoint. Although I do think, at the end of the second day, where the judge is like, well, you've got to figure out what happened here, or else, I guess, like, I don't know. I think that's asking a lot of the legal profession personally, but that's the kind of, they nod at some point and they're like, oh yeah, the reason why this is the way it is that, of course, they made that change to the legal system a few years ago because it was so clogged up. Everything's got to be done in 3 days. And I was like, and there's only one case as well. I was like, I'm not sure this is a good legal foundation upon which to build a society, but I'm pleased that they're spending one line to go, okay, that stuff that you're, kind of bothered by, here, I'm waving my hands for you.
Right. Clearly, as it relates, you mentioned some of the detective aspects as it relates to the legal trappings of this game. Clearly it is, thinly veiled at best of that it actually is such. We've been applying too much real logic and meaning to what, even last episode, debating like how close is this to the real Japanese.
Yes, and we have a couple people letting us know.
Yeah, so it's like, that's obviously not the point. This is a satire. This is a game trying, kind of just have some melodrama and poking of fun and things like that. And it sounds like we will return to another topic in the emails related to some of that, so I'll wait for that. But I get what they're trying to do, at least. Whether they succeed in every character's case or not is a different story. But yeah, I mean, the reason I brought up the detective aspect of what you were mentioning is, like, this is, and you know, thinking about Hotel Dusk and what was the other one you mentioned that, oh, no, Trauma Center wasn't like that. But the few that I have dabbled with and not finished, you know, I think mysteries and the detective tropes, I would think, and some of the other titles I know of that have been popular have, you know, similar sort of motivations. I think those probably work really well for this genre. And so I can totally see why there's so much detectiving in this game, even though you're a defense lawyer and even though it's largely focused on sort of the most iconic parts of the game are obviously in the courtroom. That's what it's kind of known for. You're an ace attorney, of course. But I mean, you know, this episode specifically, or this section we played, very much felt like a detective game to me. You know,
agreed.
Not only because there are a lot more characters, which obviously multiplies out the permutations for the puzzling, but also because there were a lot more locations, and you're a lot more sort of pixel hunting going on and sort of piecing that stuff together. And so, you know, the merger of those two things creates sort of a distance for me, at least, because, you know, you're a lawyer, right? And so I start, there's my crazy cat in the background making some noises, sorry, with a cone on her head. I start comparing it to detective stories in games when that happens, because I feel like Phoenix was doing a lot more detectiving, not only just on the fly in the courtroom, but just, you know, piecing things together. In fact, there are lots of pieces of evidence you don't even actually use in the case in the courtroom. So it's like, that's another sort of sign that it's really about sort of, there's a lot more detectiving going on. But I started, like, I'm a huge...
I'm sorry. That's the third time, and I've just got to say, it's just detecting.
Detecting. Okay. Detectiving. I'm making that word up. I want that to be a word.
Okay. He's out there. Come on, man. He's Matlocking.
He's Sherlocking.
Oh my goodness.
Speaking of Sherlock, I'm a huge Sherlock.
I wanted you to take me through that, because you mentioned it pre-show and we didn't dive into it because we didn't want to burn the pod, as it were. But tell me about that.
Well, the reason I bring it up is mainly because I'm such a big Sherlock Holmes fan.
World's greatest detectivator, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. All right, I see this is going to go on and on. No, because I'm such a big fan of the detectiving that he does. And I like the structure of those stories and sort of the way that they present him piecing together, he and Watson piecing together the solutions, and how, of course, Sherlock Holmes famously is known to be the, you know, heroic at deduction, right? And so you kind of, when he starts explaining how the logic of everything fits together, it usually comes out in such a, like, oh my God, I never saw that, but it's so perfect. Like, he makes total sense, you know, and he kind of saw through the veil of it all. But
in the best stories, I mean, because I'll push back a little bit on Sherlock Holmes, because I find some of the stuff in the original stories really obtuse. Like, oh yes, I happen to have written a monograph on the types of cigarette ash, and I noticed that, and it's like, really, dude?
Yeah. No,
I can't notice that. Like, no. It's not described, it's presented in the final moments, and, you know, but I take your point generally.
No, and I am making a general point, because it's not consistent all the time. And obviously there's been lots of Sherlock Holmes fiction and, you know, remakes, and some are better than others, taking some of those stories and reimagining them. And Sherlock Holmes specifically, and I don't want to dwell too much on this connection, by the way, but Sherlock Holmes specifically is known, like I said, to be super heroic in the abilities that he has to sort of dissect stuff. And all that being said, all I'm really meaning is, as even in some cases as far-fetched as the connection is, you can you can still find a thread, even though it might be far-fetched, a thread that leads back to knowledge that results in his conclusion. And I feel like, as compared to Phoenix, I think that sometimes the twists and turns and the connections are there just to confound you, and to throw you off in such a way. Like, again, like you said, your pushback is still appropriate, but at the core of Sherlock Holmes, there still is a sort of science behind it. And some stories are better than others, but here I just feel like I miss the extra effort maybe that was put into some of it. It feels like they're kind of more band-aiding going on with a
little haphazard. Yeah.
How to trick the player into seeing things differently, or to trick them into seeing, not seeing something at all and revealing to them as a surprise later. An example of that being, sometimes all you have to do is go back to a place and there's a character there that wasn't there before.
That was in my notes. Yep.
So yeah. And so, I mean, it's a stretch of an analogy, but I only bring it up because of my personal interest in Sherlock Holmes. And though, like you said, there's a stretch there to be sure as well, I just like that style of storytelling in mysteries and detective stories, where no matter how far-fetched it is, there's still sort of like, you can trace it all. You can rebuild the logic flow of everything after the fact, even if it was some superheroic thing that, Sherlock Holmes knew how to dissect. And I just don't find that to be the case all the time in here. And it's obviously unrealistic to expect probably a
quickly
satire,
made visual novel, satirical mystery game.
Because we're talking about, in my opinion, one of the greatest authors of British literature, and so I'm not necessarily expecting that, but I'm more kind of talking about the logical kind of reconstruction of it, and how you get to each of those nodes on the logic tree,
right.
And
I totally agree with. I mean, first of all, we're going to have to broaden out your reading of British literature. But second of all, I totally agree in that there's a lot of things here that are stretches that are clearly abstractions for games that don't even make sense in the context of the game. Like, oh, well, they couldn't have gotten to the studio because the monkey was across the path. Like, really? This kid walked around in the forest. You make this huge deal out of it. I mean, it's just like there's a lot of stuff where it's like, even within the logic of the game, it doesn't make sense. But I do think that there's a sort of, and maybe there's some like cultural stuff around, I don't know, cleanliness and presentation, and an adult would never go through the woods or something like that. Like, I don't know what the defense there is, but it's clearly like in the lot, there's nothing presented in the game that would tell you that. So, the logic is kind of lost. And one of them's a total slob, one of the, suspects. And
that's kind of that's kind of my point is that sort of attention to detail is very tricky in a game, in a puzzle game, because those sorts of things will throw you off.
Oh yeah. I was thrown off for a long time. Like, this is something I mentioned last time of like, there was a clue that in my head was meaningful. And I kept wanting it to be meaningful. And that was in this picture so there's this whole thing where there's a security camera that has taken a picture of the apparent killer, the steel samurai, having passed on his way to Studio One. And every time I looked at that picture, all I could see was his pants are far too long.
Yeah, me too. No, it's the same thing.
Literally every time.
I was convinced it was a shorter suspect.
Right.
So all of the short suspects, all the short characters were on my suspect list.
Right. And it would say like, well, no, he's clearly limping, because I'm like, yeah, but both pant legs are that way. Like, that doesn't make any, right? I just literally every time I saw the image, I'm like, I can't wait to present, this thing that I see, right? That clearly I'm meant to see. That was the thing that was driving me crazy. Is like, clearly I'm supposed to see this, right? It's so blatant. So I think that, there is a sort of, that's a careless thing to have done, right? I mean, that's a careless detail in that image that is just badly done. I mean, there should be a clearly visible, both feet should be clearly visible, and one should be clearly dragging, right, or something. Like, I don't know how they illustrate, and maybe the person who illustrated that just wasn't good at feet, right? I mean, there's plenty of reasons why that might have happened. There aren't a lot of feet in the game, to be honest. So it's possible that just wasn't their forte. But at the same time, it's like, yes, but you're making such a big deal, out of this bit of evidence, and and you're clearly showing me something else. I'm clearly able to make a deduction, and we both did, apparently. So it's I'm not crazy. I'm not seeing something that's not there. To me, I was like, this is so obvious. Like, how dare they make this so obvious, right? I mean, it's like, and then it's not there. So I mean, I was the same way about that. The other thing that you touched on, and we'll kind of back my way into another thing I found a little problematic this time. And we can talk about it as a general design constraint, because there are interesting trade-offs there that they're making. But anyway, to get there, I really did not like how often random characters would pop up just because I went back to a place.
Yeah. We had this discussion, and I forget which game. There was another game that had a similar problem where it's kind of old school design, where it's like you need to go back to a place to trigger a thing, and it's like it might have even been Chrono Trigger. No, I don't think it was Chrono Trigger. It was something in a similar structure where the next thing you had to do was just to physically return to a place, unfortunately,
right.
And that just triggered another event, and that's just how the designers put it together. So kind of unfair,
totally. Because there were a lot of times where I was like, I know I want to talk to this person. I know I want to find this kid again, or the second time or whatever. Like, I know that I'm kicking the grate off of, or the cardboard off of this hole in the wall, because that's going to let this kid in. That is clear, that this is what's going to happen. But then to actually find that kid means traipsing around.
Yeah, it's like he's not where they weren't consistent, right? Characters would show up in different places, so you didn't have a clear expectation there either.
Yeah, and the assistant, one time is in the trailer, and one time is in the dressing room, and it's one time on the, it's very like, and that's right. And now we can kind of back into the other topic, which was like this game has this like weird, like, and I'm not even sure it's bad, but it just was at times frustrating to me. Conception of the way the world is constructed, in that in order to get to a place, I have to go to every other place on the node graph to get there, which is a very like old school text adventure kind of thing. Like, oh, there's a map. You have to go east and then north and then east again to get to the whatever thing. But here I don't think there's any need for it, and like it's maybe there are like. Maybe there's too many locations to be able to see easily on a screen, but you could do that with a scroll bar. Like, I mean, there's a lot of ways that you could just address this. I don't know that in a game so unrealistic about so many things that there needs to be realism about how spaces are connected.
Yeah. I think I agree. I think it just is one of those holdovers from adventure game structure that they didn't want to let go of. And, when you're working in a genre that is expanding from and also just literally expanding another genre like adventure games, you're hesitant to change that paradigm on a whim. You know what I mean?
Right.
Lightly, I was going to say, change it lightly. And so I can see them holding to it, even though if they really thought about it for a second, like we are, you don't need to do it. And I would bet that maybe they change that in future versions. But you're basically asking for fast travel right?
Yeah, I am. I mean,
why not?
Because there was many places where I'm like, oh, I know I want to go here now.
Yeah.
And it's in this particular one, it's particularly irritating because it's like there's two nodes over here on the left side, but I have to pass through a third node, and then I have to go through the gate to get to the employee room to get. It's like a big long line.
There's a couple bottlenecks that don't need.
It's a long line that I've got to go through multiple times, and I went through a lot because there were times where I'm like, what am I missing? And I'm missing a random character who's going to pop up somewhere, and. Which, I would have gotten there eventually anyway, because I would have said, well, okay, I'm clearly missing something. Let me go to all the locations, right? And I'd much rather be able to do that. So, yeah, maybe that's a thing that they address in the future. Maybe, and we haven't finished the game yet. So there's also the possibility that this structure is really important in what's left of the game. So there's also that possibility that it actually matters. I can't imagine how, but it's possible.
Or even maybe just a different interface, right? Like have the interface for each episode be a map, and you're just object oriented, going, clicking on the map, the location you want to go to, right, versus having it be menu based. There's lots of different solutions. I'd actually love, if anyone cares to, because we're not that knowledgeable about this genre. And I would definitely, as I've already said, I like most of the game, and so I can see why Phoenix Wright is considered to be one of the sort of the apex of the genre. I would love to hear from people other visual novel must plays, and I heavily include indie games in that too, because I know there's a lot of great indie games. But like, what's some of the best ones that have solved some of these, I think, very solvable problems, in a modern context. So,
you had mentioned earlier Hotel Dusk. I actually pulled that out and have been playing it a little bit because I realized I had played very little of that at the time. I think I just didn't grok it really, or maybe something else was just going on at the time, is always possible, especially as my kids would have been quite young at the time. So it's possible I was just busy with life. But yeah, I popped it in a little bit. It's another thing, because it's on the DS, I can just close the DS and leave it plugged in somewhere and pick it up later. It's been good for like short burst because of this eye problem I've been having. And it's got similar kind of, it's a real space, and you're navigating through it in this kind of like drag the pen in the direction you want to go kind of interface.
Oh, that's right.
On the top down, with a top down abstract map. And there, I like that. It works a lot because there's a lot of places where it's very similar in the sense that, like, oh, I'm walking past a place and something happens because I walked past it. So I'm walking down this hallway in the hotel and a door opens, or I hear somebody whistling, or or whatever. So I hear things that are related to the spaces I'm passing through, but the whole space is there.
Yeah, it's got a more of a sense of constructed
of connectedness.
place,
It's an actual 3D place in a sense, right? Even if it's presented in this kind of abstract way, in this fully connected way, and I'm going through doors and things like that. So it kind of works for me in a way that like makes sense in a way that this one didn't. So I just wanted to give kind of like, here's another visual novel that has sort of the same problem in that sense, but it works there for me, so it's okay. It's not necessarily a constraint that I hate in and of itself. It's just here. It just drives me crazy. So,
right.
But I did want to point that out as another, like, oh, here's another game that just, does a different thing. Anyway, I'm not sure what problem the moving solves, and maybe it is just purely a holdover. Because certainly I think that game Portopia sort of has that sense as well of like, oh, this is an adventure gamey kind of thing, even though it's quite an early one. That places like, and there's a certain sense to that, like we adapted that from reality, right? So it's not it's not necessarily bad. I don't know.
Yeah, but I mean, it is essentially a fast travel system is the solution to some degree. I mean, I know we have to go too deeply into it, but maybe because there's some cases where they lock off some of the areas. So you want to see that sort of linearity, for
Yeah.
instance.
I mean, they do that here.
Yeah, they do, right.
At a certain point, you hand in that key card. And maybe that's a good place to kind of turn to that. But yeah, maybe there's places where whole things are pruned or it matters, in some way. And that's why I'm leaving that open as a possible reason. Like maybe that's going to come up. Or maybe they just didn't want to close that door in the future and they knew, that it would be. So, hi, James. Yeah. Or was that not James?
No, it's James.
Yep. Oh, okay.
James Taylor, the cat.
Singing.
She's having a hard time.
Podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Sorry, folks, but yep, more animals on the cast. Let's see.
Yeah. So what was I saying that? I already lost what I was just saying there. Oh, that you hand in this evidence. So basically something that I thought would be evidence, this key card, they're basically expanding. This was another topic for us, that there's different reasons why you have the evidence. And it really at this point becomes more of an inventory than purely evidence. Right. It becomes a more traditional adventure game inventory in the sense that there's a lot of objects here that, you pointed out in pre-show are really just fetch quest items that you had to get to, you have to get a thing to trade off to literally trade cards with this kid or get something back from, the security guard or what have you. So it becomes a much more traditional adventure game in that sense as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, they're doing the typical, it'd be interesting to know. I don't think we'll probably do the research on it, but it'd be interesting to know if there was an engine that they were riffing off of with this game, or if they built it for the game. But it's the typical like taking a certain engine structure and bending it to do things beyond what it was intended to do. And so
right,
as just a hypothetical, I have no evidence.
Leia to Marcus.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, that's a deep cut for the podcast there. But yeah, I mean, maybe if, say, for instance, as a hypothetical with no evidence of this, no pun intended, that this was specifically built for Phoenix Wright and visual novels and courtroom dramas, and then they decided to, we want to have some fetch quests and we want to have some conversation, sort of optional conversation objects that you can use, like the end of this case where you get to actually kind of talk Will Powers out of his sort of depression or what have you, or just kind of being bummed about things, and then kind of. So you show him the book from the fan, the kid, and kind of cheer him up or whatever he says there. I forget exactly what happens, but that I'm pretty sure that would have been just an optional moment, But it is cool because it's in your inventory. You have this book; it has the history, and then you're like, oh, hey, look at this, and you don't expect it to apply to this at the end of the episode, right? You don't expect to ever need it again, but then. You're like, we're having this conversation. And then an option comes up of, do you want to present evidence to him in this conversation? You're like, what? Oh, do I? And this wasn't the first time they did it, but it's like, oh yeah, sure I do. I'll look through my evidence to see if there's something that would help this guy. And it turns out there was. And so it adds a nice character moment, a nice little story moment, and it stretches the interface, which is cool. I mean, any good designer is trying to stretch things beyond what
absolutely
to be used for. So I definitely support it.
Yeah, no, it's also very natural to do that over the course of a game. Is like, well, what other ways can we use this thing? I was while you were talking, I was looking up the development of this because I was like, yeah, I wonder if they did use an engine, and they didn't. This was a relatively early GBA title. It was originally going to be a Game Boy Color title, and they switched it to GBA. And this is a game that took 10 months to make, 7 people. So I guess I have to keep that in mind too at times, that there's not a lot of room for design innovation on that kind of schedule as well. So.
Yeah, that would actually explain maybe some of the constraints in the design as well. Then, if it was originally a GBA game or GB Color game, that they may not have redesigned since. So now I'm kind of really intrigued to see what one of the more recent ones would have done. And it's also kind of a little bit, kind of bums me out with Capcom's recent record of remakes, that they didn't do more with this one. I mean, the art definitely is an upgrade and beautiful. And I would bet that a lot of the audio is quite a bit better quality too, but
absolutely,
design wise and structure wise, I think they could have made some updates pretty easily to make it more modern. But it seems like kind of more of a straight port. So, but yeah, anyway.
Also a reasonable question to ask, like, you've got this thing, I mean, it's like, do you want to reimagine a thing, or do you want to, like, I mean, there are people who just want the straight port. They just want the,
fair. There's audiences for both, for sure.
And
Capcom's been known to do both, just the straight, unapologetic port, and then also some amazing remakes. So they definitely can do both, but obviously each one costs very different amounts. So I get it from a business standpoint. But I definitely have, I mean, in summary, for some of my thoughts, even though I've had some criticisms, the melodrama of it all, especially the way that they that they make, and it kind of goes back to your point about a 7-person team on a Game Boy Color. The ways that they've made the Switch version, or probably any of the modern versions, really like emphasize the drama or the melodrama of what's going on and make it more exciting than it really is hilarious to me, and quite successful, I think. The rumble, the screen shake, the audio sounds, the pacing, times when you can skip text and times when you cannot. They make you read it, or they make you go by faster, with like the guard character for the studio, points when she just kind of goes on, and you're like, wait, I can't read, but wait, I'm not really supposed to kind of fully get everything because she's just kind of
unloading,
rambling. So I really appreciate how clever they've been with all of that, and it adds to the mystique and kind of style of the game in quite a good way. And so that's been fun, because it's like, it's always neat to see a team with, in this case, heavy constraints, I would say, find ways to really make it more than it really is. If you were to strip things away, it's just a kind of a text logic chain. And most specifically, I want to mention the music. I think the music is stellar, and the way they use the music as you're ramping up, going back to one of my earlier points of like layering in the case, and kind of like breaking the case, building the case over time, and how the music really seems to go well with each escalation. Especially by the end, when you get the sort of close-up camera shots, with the scrolling backgrounds and stuff, or you get like we kind of equated it to a fighting game last episode, but when you get like a good shot on one of the, the lying witnesses, and it's almost like they get hit,
right?
Nice reaction, and then the audio plays and the music ramps up, and there's just it's really well it's really polished in that sort of the orchestration of all of those pieces together, and that's a feat by itself.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really good. I noticed in this case, there were also additional new sort of motion graphics as well, of like, the person was here and they went through here, like, to be very clear, which was really interesting. Like, I don't know if they were concerned that players wouldn't be able to follow that, and maybe this is another argument for making the world a real connected place. Like, they had to come from the employee area, blump, 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 and walk by the camera, blump, blump, blump here, and then go to Studio One, blump, blump, blump over here. And this was like literally animated on a map.
Yeah.
Something that comes into play later is that you actually have an interface to go do basically another way that they sort of stretch their verbs or their mechanical elements is to have points in the cross-examination where you point out information like, oh, well, look, in this picture, dun, 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 there's a 2, or that means they were dun 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 at this point of the map, right? And things like that. So there's also some good, growth of those mechanics there that I thought was really enjoyable, and does also have that like dramatic, because it's new. It's just naturally dramatic. Like, oh, I haven't seen this. I haven't gotten to do this, or this is a new way to use this. In this game that I thought was well done, and is like you say, a typical way that you try to stretch what you have to do more. And it's always that kind of, that sort of thing that's very natural to game development, especially, well, on any team. I was going to say, especially with a small team, but really on any team, you want to get the most out of what you have. And yeah, I mean, I think the tough thing is with such a small team, like you didn't have a lot of time to do that. But yeah, it's neat.
Well, and I think in that case, the example you give, you gave about sort of that added interface gives you more sort of engagement and like ownership over sort of, or you become more of an investigator because you're kind of hands-on, so to speak, right? And you feel more engaged with it. It's more interactive rather than just sort of watching it all kind of go by in this card kind of way. So that was a nice little surprise of them pushing things. But I just think the game so far is just a great example of, I'm coming to this now as we're talking about it, but I think it is a great example of a game with constraints and how much you can do with that, and be really clever. Because I think the style, the character representation topics aside for a second, unfortunately, I think, but the style overall is very good. And like they really made a lot out of a little. And the animations, right? It's like they could have, in these modern versions, they could have fully animated a lot of that stuff, but I think there's a certain charm to the stilted, only, a few frames per character that they have to cycle through the emotions, and the reactions and stuff. And that's part of, I think, the charm of it as well. And so it's to counter my earlier point about why they didn't kind of do more of a remake style of this. There is something to be said for the old school nature of how it feels. And so you would lose that if you kind of overdid it, because you can easily mess that up as well. Oh
yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely. Yep. No, they do squeeze a lot out of, a little, and they design their characters to those kind of broad presentations, for good and ill, obviously. But that the kid who has the katana that he can't quite draw off of his back, like there are issues with that character, in and of himself, but that's a great little bit of characterization that he, about this kid, right? Is like, he's done this thing because he sees it on TV, but he hasn't made the connection that sometimes what you see on TV is not something people can do. So that's also kind of funny. But yeah, tells a lot about that character.
A quick note: I did not see. I don't think they trained you on it, but I did not see at first the new interface of being able to slide the location screen in a couple cases.
It was not new. That was in the case with Mia getting killed.
Oh my gosh! Then I never used it.
Yeah, you can use it in the murder scene, but there's nothing. There is a piece of there is a bit there that you could miss, but it's not relevant in the sense that you can present it or anything like that. It's just some of that evidence, like I was talking about earlier, that tells more of the story. So in that scene, like you're there, you're looking at her body in the window, right? But if you slide, it takes you to the other half of the office, which is what you normally see in that office later. In fact, I don't think you can slide in the office in the future, but it's basically the other half of that office. There's a little table with a phone on it where the wiretap was, and it basically is like, there's loose screws on the table.
Whoa. Yeah, I never saw that because I didn't slide. I didn't know I could slide.
You didn't know you could, yeah.
How funny that I was able to finish without that. In this case, I don't think I would have been able to.
No, I think you have to. Yeah,
must have finally looked at the
prompt.
The prompts, but there wasn't
you finally detected it.
I detected it. down at the bottom of the screen that I finally read, apparently. But it's just like it's on some screens and not on others, and then it's
right.
it's
true.
not very advertised. But
It's certainly not very prominent.
I just thought it was funny.
In fact, one of the things that's been driving me a little bit crazy is that almost all of this game could be played with one Joy-Con in my right hand,
right?
Except that the stick doesn't move up and down for like locations you want to go or whatever, or dialogue topics. So you have to play with both, even though it's like, well, I have a stick over here. Like, why don't both sticks just do the thing? Like, some maddening choices. Like, come on, now that's an easy thing to have done. Plus there's 2 additional buttons on the side. This totally should be a one Joy-Con game.
So on the Game Boy, that would have been, right? It would have been all on the
D-pad and A and B and
shoulder. No, but I mean, as far as navigation goes, they would.
Well, there were the shoulders as well, right? So the sliding and the going to the records would have been on the. I'm sure we're on the shoulder buttons on the GBA, or on the 3DS for that matter.
Yeah, maybe so. Yeah. I mean, what's more is I have the drifting Joy-Con issue on mine right now. So for this game, it's hilarious because I'm trying to pixel hunt with my cursor drifting around. So it's super lame.
That's fun.
Yeah, makes a little added extra challenge. But overall, it's a fun section. So I'd be interested to see how it kind of finishes off. We're going to do just one more, right?
I believe there's just I think there is. I know that there are. I believe that there's another case after the next one, but I think that's the thing that was added on at some later date.
Rise from the Ashes, it's called.
It was
not in the original Game Boy Advance. This murder was new featured in the DS. So it wasn't in the original. It was new to the DS, though.
Yeah, and I've had feedback from folks who've said, it feels a little tacked on and weird. I think actually that was in Ben Zaug's email last week. So we can, I think we'll not go to that. I don't necessarily think that will introduce anything new. And I think just finishing off this kind of main 3-act story arc makes a lot of sense. You can sort of see, they've already teased some stuff going on with Edgeworth, maybe, which is interesting. I'm kind of curious to see where all that goes.
That was a good reversal, by the way. That was
there was, It
was fun to kind of, I feel like that's another sort of trope you see sometimes in some other like TV or something. I feel like I have a vague memory of that happening someplace where you see the two of them, two sides ganging up, right? Because the witness or the suspect is so bad, it's like you got to team up to get this guy or whatever.
Well, yeah, and it also is like a, it's I think it would be a common criticism you might have of legal systems that they're not, in an adversarial system such as the one presented here, or the real one that we have here in the States, right? The goal isn't to get to the truth.
Yeah, the goal
right?
Is to win.
And in this case, right, there's sort of there's an aspect to Edgeworth's behavior which is I wanted to get to the truth.
That's why I liked it. Yeah, he was helping. He saw things that you weren't seeing. And again, I don't know if we mentioned it on air last episode, but that third season of Serial is a great example of that. At least in the U.S.
that fact,
what that system creates as far as how people navigate the system. But, and I'm talking about the lawyers.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, let's just move straight into. Yeah, we've already mentioned we're going to finish this next time, but let's move straight into feedback. We had a review last week that was in fact cut off. Remember, it said not only Brett or whatever it said.
Oh yeah. It wasn't trolling you.
Yeah, so I have the full review this time, and I've had other people say, I tried to put in the thing and it didn't all go, and they'll email them in. There's another thing about reviews in one of the emails that'll come up later. But anyway, this was the full thing from SamSpot. Fantastic podcast for anyone interested in the history of video games, aspiring developers, or someone simply looking for recommended games to play and think deeply about. Not only do Brett and Tim bring their own great insights, but they also bring on really notable and interesting guests and draw out stories you've never known about your favorite games. If that isn't enough, they also read listener emails and talk deeply about the questions we ask. Wow. S-Rank Podcast, 5 stars isn't enough. May your heart be your guiding key. So a little wow. Additional Kingdom Hearts in there at the end.
Multi-layered review. Very well done.
Yeah, we got a Gran Turismo. Well, S ranks and a million things, I suppose.
I feel like Phoenix Wright could benefit from an S rank system someday. I think that would be fun because I think there's some other good examples of that.
Right, like if you uncover all the stuff. Maybe,
I mean, some sort of ranking by the end.
Yeah. Well, there's that. You mentioned Sherlock Holmes. There's a great board game there, Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, in which the players get to do some detectiving.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Good.
But there is a ranking system. Well, it's not really a ranking system, but there's a points system that you could apply a ranking system on, which is basically, well, how many times do you visit places in the game that Sherlock didn't have to visit, and like how many questions did it take you to ask and answer and things like that, and how many of the the things at the end did you get, right? There's some questions at the end that basically are the solution to the mystery.
Right.
And so there are natural ways to do that. So yeah, I would totally agree that this would tend to adapt well to that. Anyway, thank you for that. Thanks for sending that in and filling that in for me, Sam Spot, because as much as I was teasing him about how that was not only for me. Anyway, we also have some emails sent to devgameclub@gmail.com, and I sent the first one over to you, as I so often do.
Okay, subject Japanese society and an objection from Dagger. He's written in before. Danielson,
I believe so. Yeah,
believe so. Hi, enjoy your show, and as always, but I do have an objection. The legal system represented in Phoenix Wright is not representative of any legal system in any country.
And we sort of covered that a little bit this time.
But... the 3-day system is something that only exists in a video game, and the way trials are held also have no relation with reality. Hearing you two theorize why Japan might be like that was both funny and infuriating at the same time. Oh man, we were way out of our depth on that one. Like, why did we even?
I don't even know why we went there.
Also, Brett, no one is allowed to introduce new evidence during a trial. That is all in caps with 4 exclamation points. If a thing is used as evidence in a trial, it must be registered beforehand. This is especially true in the U.S. courts. No one, not defense, nor prosecution, or judge, or police, is allowed to introduce evidence during a trial. This includes the U.S. and Japanese legal system. All right, there's that point. Correction. On a different note, I love Japanese games and a large part of the Japanese culture, but I always have to attach an in spite of its blatant misogyny, Japanese culture and society is incredibly misogynistic, which sadly colors a lot of the products coming from there. When I talk about some of my favorite games, I often have to attach an, even though it has problematic misogynistic scenes and or characters. I love JRPGs. One of my favorite games in that genre is Persona 4, which had a recent PC release prompting my 15th replay. Nice. Wow. But it has...
Those are not short games, by the way.
Jeez, that's kudos.
I mean, what was it, 110 or something like that? For Persona 5.
That's major. Like when you love something, man, I support it. I play World of Warcraft still. But it has several problematic scenes and characters. Persona 4 is a fantastic game, but it does include several blatantly misogynistic scenes, and some scenes are extremely problematic in terms of sexuality, which is a theme explored in Persona. I do find it sad that I have to attach a disclaimer whenever I talk about some of my favorite games, and the game that probably has some of the most influence on who I am as a person. I hope you keep up the good work you are doing with fun, insightful talks on games from the past. Best regards, Dagger A. Danielson. I didn't attempt the
Yeah.
The real pronunciation of best regards in Norwegian. We don't know, actually.
I don't recall. I think it's come up before though. So apologies that I didn't.
Sorry again. Let us know, Dagger.
Ignorant Americans here.
Yep. Understand legal systems. Thank you for the clarification, though. Does that mean that you're maybe he is a lawyer,
possibly, or maybe he also is. I was going to say that, like, I realized and this is something we talked about a little bit in pre-show, like almost anything I know about the law for me has come from television. I realized that, like, thinking about that this week, like, what do I know about the legal system? Oh, yeah, pretty much nothing. I mean, I've been called for jury duty before, and I was excused because that. They were like, oh, look at this guy. Really? No, but it was I'm sure it was like malpractice or I don't know, something, but they asked about, well, does anybody have family member who's a doctor? And I'm like, well, I do. So, yep, thanks. We don't need you then. Yeah. And that was it. So I'm good for some number of years. And that was my only chance ever to be involved in a case in any way. And so, yeah, I realized, kind of like thinking about it and also trying to think of a book recommendation for this game, like, oh, I have no idea. Like, this is not brief. Like, I don't really know anything about the legal system. I will say, like, I that's a common trope that new evidence is brought up in trials and like TV shows and things like that. And like they grumble, there's a sidebar, oh, this just came up, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I have to imagine it's possible, but maybe it simply becomes a mistrial at that point. If it's exonerating evidence, or maybe they just agree. Like there was something about, like, I was reading about this after this email came in. It's like, well, there's this inter-party review, but like that's some kind of trials and some other kind of trials. Like there's not a lot of clear descriptions of this sort of thing online, or at least it's very hard to search. So anyway, thanks for the clarification, because of course the second email is another clarification. Subject is attorney's badge and is from Edwin. Hi, Brett and Tim. You probably have had this feedback from a lot of people. We haven't already, but lawyers' badges are a very important part of the Japanese legal system. And Edwin here provides an article I'll put a link to in the show notes in the Japan Times. I guess this highlights how embedded cultural practices can seem strange when ported directly to another region, especially court practices, which vary so wildly. For example, it is funny how many people in Australia understand police and court practices from U.S. shows rather than knowing their own legal system. Best, Edwin. So, I guess everybody down under is also learning about the American legal system, just how I am, which is from Law and Order and LA Law.
There's a podcast down there somewhere that is completely convinced of something that happens in Australia that is not the case.
Yeah.
That is amazing and awesome that that the badges are a real thing. And, it's like law enforcement or something, right? Like I think that's neat.
Yeah, I presume so. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, lawyers.
I just thought that was funny because it also there's also, I think there was a point in this one where I was like, maybe to get past the security guard, I think I was like, oh, I should just show my badge.
Totally. Yep.
Like, that's why this is here, I was thinking, and I'm like, I'll just pull this out. And it wasn't. And I think it instead showed to Maya. God, I'm going to do that for the whole podcast.
Yeah, unfortunate.
And they lean into that. They make it worse. The whole.
Well, additionally, they talk about how that character looked up to authority figures, right? And so I thought, oh, this is it. She's going to see my badge and think that I'm an authority figure. I'm a badass. It didn't work, but
no,
the headcanon you come up with, right? When in a puzzle game, when you're trying to, or an adventure puzzle game, when you're trying to solve mysteries.
Yeah, well, you're trying to get in that designer's head, right? So
yeah.
Anyway, thank you for the clarification, Edwin, and I'll put that in the show notes, and I intend to read it as well. So, thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead with that. The next one. I have another one beyond that.
Okay, we're still going. All right,
we're still going. We can do it. Yeah.
There is no subject to this one. From Matt A. And a note, it has been edited down a bit. So getting to some of his specific points, getting the big one out of the way first, this could be entirely based on the bubbles I am a part of, but I've never heard the games described as sexist before. I don't flat out disagree. I would definitely agree the moments that were talked about could be called stereotypical, provocative, or distasteful, none of which are good descriptions, obviously, but I personally don't think the series has treated women as lesser than men. For what it's worth, I actually know multiple fans of the series in person who are women who have never described the games as sexist. I will agree that the first impression isn't fantastic, but if it's any concession, your main character being male is the subordinate of a female character, regardless of how they chose to use her outside of that fact. Fortunately, the series does not have a thread of victims being mostly women, although I see that being an easy misconception given where we stopped last episode. Yep, okay. And then there are no more female victims in AA1. And taking the entire series into account, there are significantly more male victims than female. Example, in the next game, every victim is male. And in the third game, 2 of the 5 victims are female. As to why I never gave the other icky stuff any more attention than an eye roll, well, speaking personally, I was a little more innocent of a kid when I first played the games. So some things just went over my head. Also, what was intended to be a very anime vibe translated to most Westerners at the time as heavy parody. Most people playing the games when they were new, not your typical anime fan. So it was kind of, sorry, it's got a lost connection, but you can hear me?
So did I. I can still hear you, and it's still recording locally, so hopefully we're good.
Okay, so it was kind of a given that nothing was meant to be taken too seriously. Tonally, the first game really does have that blunt, hit you over the head satirical personality. Which leads me to the supernatural stuff. I understand it's not for everyone, but unfortunately it doesn't go away either. In fact, with the exclusion of one new mechanic, off the top of my head, every new mechanic added in the series has a supernatural explanation. That being said, some I really like and some I don't. For example, in the second game during the investigation phase, Phoenix gets an item that allows him to know if a character is keeping a secret or withholding info. I say cool. That sounds awesome. This triggers a mini game. Oh, cool. Where you need to answer dialogue correctly to present evidence/character profiles to get them to reveal their secrets. I like this change as it made important dialogue during the investigation phase more exciting and varied. There's also a mechanic that lets you detect body language during the trials to be used as evidence. That's cool. I find that one quite silly. And he said,
yes, well, we see where Tim is.
I love it. It sounds great. And in the latest entry, there's one that lets you see the victim's last moments from their point of view. Whoa. You may think these sound like gimmicks, and you'd be right. However, not all are bad. Huge thanks to you guys for continually putting out such a great show. Sorry for making you read this entire short essay. That's the end. So, yeah, I don't know. We've covered the first topic quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to say a little bit about that because I actually like, I had somebody reach out to me and say, "Oh, I'm so happy that you're going to be talking about, Phoenix Wright is a game I love, right?" And I said, "Oh, okay, well, I gotta let you know up front, since you're a huge fan of the series, and I knew you were a huge fan of the series, like the first thing we talk about is how sexist." And he was like, "Oh yeah, it's horrible." Horribly sexist game. So this was coming from a fan, right? And like, so one of the things I want to say, and this both addresses some of the sexuality stuff that about persona and all that stuff, is that it's okay to like things that have problems, right? And this is gonna come up in the next email as well. But I don't think we can just ignore the fact that it has problems or that we find problems. Persona was brought up, and in pre-show I was talking about how, well, yeah, Persona 5 had these characters that they changed in Persona 5 Royal because of a cultural change, and this will come up in the next email. but because of cultural difference, I was like, well, this is a terrible homophobic rather stereotype, you know. And it's like, well, it's based on some television characters in Japan. I'm like, yeah, but those are also terrible homophobic stereotypes. Like, it doesn't make it better that it's based on something else in the culture. Like, yes, Japanese culture is misogynistic and sexist. That doesn't make it okay. Like, I think it's our job. It doesn't make it okay to me, right? And as critics, as we're acting here, that's our job, you know, is to talk about those things. And then the other thing I wanted to say about that in particular is, like, just because some people don't see it does not mean that others don't.
Yes, right.
Yeah, that others do.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah. The one thing that has to be said and not overlooked is that so far, other than Matt mentioning some of his female friends, nobody, including Brett and I, are women. And so we, you know, to really talk appropriately about this topic, you would want to talk to women about it, right? Just to put that out there. And we're white men to boot. So there's added extra complexity.
Old white men to boot.
Old. I mean,
in your case, anyway.
We're like the worst. Yeah. But the other side of it is, I think, especially appropriate to mention because, again, speaking as a man, not as a woman. So, like, you have to take my opinion with a grain of salt. But I think, to Matt's point, I don't want to put words in his mouth or his friends' mouths, but the fact that, and I'm kind of trying to sort of channel my wife here, who really kind of educates me on sort of these perspectives, and my daughter. If there are women who don't necessarily see or have forgiven some of the stuff that happens in this game because obviously they're fans, some of that is the societal sort of preconceived notions that they have been taught through these kinds of problems. They have been, you know, sort of conditioned to be an apologist for things that really, you know, that have created a systemic problem. And so, there are ways to be satirical and stereotypical without being offensive in these, you know, and perpetuating this sort of like these systemic examples that we have, you know, become accustomed to for so many years that kind of have to stop. And even though they might be subtle and small and forgivable because of a culture or something like that, each little one kind of chips away at the core problem, and it creates, you know, a kind of a bad sense of self for certain, you know, groups. So anyway, that was more than I wanted to say, but
no, well, I mean, it's well said. So well said, Waldorf. There's a Muppet reference to point out that I'm really old from like the 70s.
That's a good comparison for us. Those two.
Anyway, so I'll take us into I think this is the last email we have on this specific topic, but it because I think this one kind of asks what should be done, and I think that's something that's worth talking more about in response to this next one. So there's kind of a thread here. The subject is localization and culture in gaming, from Sean. Hi, Brett and Tim, and again, I've cut some kudos for time, but we thank you. I would love to leave a review for the cast. Oh, this is one that I left in because it is informative, and I had to look this up. Google Podcast doesn't seem to allow it. If you have a recommendation on the most beneficial way for me to do this, please do let me know. They also pay to mention this on the cast for other listeners. It's not so simple to review podcasts if you're not using an Apple product. Had no idea that Google Podcast doesn't allow reviews. I went and looked it up, and turns out that's true. I don't actually use any... I don't actually even use Apple's podcast infrastructure anymore, but I know a lot of people do. So anyway, I guess what I would just say is please tell a friend, because that's really what it's about, is trying to spread us around a little bit. Anyway, on to the rest of the email. I've really enjoyed Phoenix Wright, but I too was disappointed in the sexist characters and dialogue and knew it would feature in your discussion. However, as someone that has played Japanese-developed games for 2 decades and loves Japanese culture, it was hardly a surprise, as sexism seems more commonplace in Japanese culture than in my own. Another great podcast, 8 to 4 Play, is hosted by members of an English localization company based in Japan. They once shared a story about how they were faced with localizing a game that featured a questionably comical transvestite character that would be offensive to a lot of Western audiences. They had to approach the developer to explain how it would be interpreted in the West and suggest alterations that were more suitable. This approach would seem to make sense, but there are also times in games where localization removes identity and culture from a game. There's a minor example in Phoenix Wright with a quote-unquote pasta house, which I imagine was certainly a noodle restaurant originally. How do you think game localization should be approached? Should both the good and bad be preserved in the interest of representing the culture in its entirety, or should changes be made to suit differing global audiences? Do you have any experiences with your own games where a different interpretation was made, or you had to make alterations with localization? It's a vexed issue for me. I certainly don't like the representations in Phoenix Wright, but at the same time, it is hard to pass judgment on another culture, and I think there is a danger in censoring issues in other parts of the world. I also would not want to miss out on the positives. There was a charm and intrigue in playing a Law and Order story about the Steel Samurai and evil magistrate. As we enter 6 weeks of strict stay-at-home orders in my city due to the average of 500 COVID-19 cases a day, it's so concerning when I see the news and see America is recording up to 50,000 a day. I hope you and your friends and families keep safe and well during this challenging time. Thank you once again, Sean from Melbourne, Australia. Thank you for that last bit there, Sean. It is a constant source of stress for me as well. So I appreciate that. And I hope you stay safe and healthy, and as do all listening. Yeah. So as far as localization goes for our own games, I don't know that I've ever had anything to do with it, other than some technical support for things like wide character support, which is to say technical support to be able to actually display characters in, for example, kanji. So for the most part, that I've never really been a part of. I don't know if you have.
There's been There's been small and large examples on every game I've worked on where I had any say in that. Usually, it's in the form of bugs that you get back during the localization process from the different territories. But I would say, a large percentage of the bugs you get back are often those sorts of things. Sometimes it's sensitivity to certain cultural aspects of how things would be translated, and sometimes it's kind of getting an okay check, like, hey, if we change it this way, is that still going to be, appropriate for the meaning, that the original meaning and stuff like that. So I can't think of a good example, and probably shouldn't share some of that stuff, to be honest. But I do.
Well, I mean, I can sort of think of like Star Wars stuff. Well, Star Wars was not really problematic most of the time because it was pretty PG, but certainly at the time, I can remember there being localization issues to go to Germany.
Germany's the main one. I would, because I've worked on
for blood color in particular.
Yeah, there's those sorts of censorship, but I'm talking even in the speech, right? That there'd be times when, that the way something was handled, but not just there. I mean, I think lots of different. Again, it's like we're talking about every culture has its own thing. So, yeah, they would come up for sure. And to be honest, to kind of hit another part of what they're asking was sort of like what is to be done about some of that stuff. To be honest,
I definitely wanted to go to that.
Yeah, I mean, I in the cases where, I mean, this was just my approach when I was the one making the final call on some of those bugs or what have you. I would tend to bend our meaning in our game, sometimes to trigger extra expenditures, right, on fixing those sorts of things, because you'd have to have stuff potentially re-recorded or retranslated or something, to the culture that the territory, that the game was going to, rather than trying to hold the line myself on, no, this is really important for whatever meaning in our game. Now, I'm not making high art, games, from a perspective of some specific message that needed to be kept. I'm sure it gets more complicated if you have a specific theme you're trying, but right. I think really sticking to, if you understand what they're saying, we would try to bend over backwards to make sure that we were abiding by the culture of the territory that it was going to, because we ultimately want people to enjoy the game where they're playing it. And everyone's going to be coming at it from a different perspective if they're in a different territory. So
yeah, I mean, I think there's issues of like centrality of the issue. Like, I certainly wouldn't want to make a game with a female protagonist who is a strong female protagonist, not overly sexualized or whatever. And then, if for some reason there was a large market in, the Arab world, for example, not be able to have that character at all. I'd push back on that and say, no, that's central to what we're saying or whatever. So I like, there's an issue there. The other thing is like, I'm actually fine with it translating straight across. As long as you got to be aware, I'm going to push back like heck, right? As a critic, right? In my critical role with this podcast in particular, but when I used to blog more, I'm going to say, look, that's gross to me. Like, I think that your society has an issue. I'd almost rather have that and be able to have the conversation, or have the localization partners be pushing back and saying, hey, look, other cultures don't treat women this way. Right. Or whatever. And not to pick on this game in particular, but, it's an issue in plenty of American games for that matter. So it's like,
oh my God. No, it's not.
This is not unique to Phoenix Wright, but it's something that we did foreground at the very start of last episode.
Yeah.
So,
well, in a different type, I was focusing specifically on localization because he was asking about localization, but on a different sort of scale, I can't tell you how many conversations that I would have about a main character or supporting cast characters in the early stages of greenlighting games in general, where somebody would say, this won't track as well in another territory, or maybe sometimes even in the US because of the characters that you're going after. And I would say, I don't care. We would.
Yeah, you have to be willing to push back.
Yeah. And at that point, you just have to have the discussion about what you are potentially sacrificing, and everyone be okay with it. Somebody has to obviously, and I can't think of a time when.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there are not nearly enough voices of people of color in American media. Right. So people have to push back on that. When people say such and such doesn't sell, it's like, well, nobody tries it. Don't tell me it doesn't sell. It's nobody lets it happen. How can you say it doesn't sell? We don't see it to buy, or whatever. So,
and that's look at the cast of Halo 5 and you'll see some of what I'm talking about. So,
do I have to?
No, not you, but I'm saying you don't have to play it to see the cast. I'm just saying, like, there were intentions there to push back on some of those. And I don't know, not to ride any company, but there's been some recent news of some corporate, I won't name the company, but some executives in certain corporations saying, if the character's not a certain thing, then it won't sell,
right.
And actually pushing that downward onto the teams and preventing them from actually, and then ironically, in the case that I won't mention the specifics of, they were wrong.
Well, exactly. And actually, and that was another thing I wanted to kind of bring up in this case, because Sean used the word censor. And actually, I want to be really careful with how we use that word, because that's not what's happening, right? Even in cases where it's changed for sensitivity in another market, these are not government agencies making that happen, at least in the cases we've so far described. That may be different if you were dealing with a female character in certain countries. I'm sure there are issues where it would rise to that level. But in most cases, certainly in the Western world and with Japan, we're talking about companies and creators making decisions, which is not a censorship question. So when we talk about like how we would change things, we're not talking about censorship or even self-censorship. We're talking about discussions that happen and translating our goals, right, to as creators or as business people or as whatever, with a particular product. Like, I could certainly see, a game made in 10 months by 7 people, which was popular on the GBA and was being re-released on the DS. Hey, we should try that in America. Like, yeah, how much are we going to change? Certainly back then, besides, like, how much are we going to change that? Probably not much, for another market. Probably not at all at that time, because who knows if it's going to even stick, but yeah. And in any case, like, this is not, in the ways we've been talking about it, a censorship question, but it is a conversation to have, a critical conversation, or an internal question to have. We hear that a lot from gamers, and I'm not picking on Sean as kind of jumping on that kind of bandwagon, but it's something that happened a lot around Gamergate or around particular games in the last 10 years. There was that one with the hyper weird proportioned characters. It was some RPG I didn't play, so I don't even remember. Dragon something, of course, because video games. But I'm sure you remember the one that I'm talking about, and people were crying, oh, it's censorship to change. I was like, no, no, it's not. Like, a character design happens, and like a lot of the reasons why we don't show stuff before it's ready is like, we don't have these conversations. We're not done. Like, recently there was that huge leak, Nintendo leak. Yeah. And I was really disappointed with the way the media treated that. Like, to me, that's like fruit of a poison tree. Like, all those people, didn't expect any of that work ever to see the light of day. Like, yeah,
it's a bummer.
I would feel really weird. Now we're on a much bigger kind of topic, but like, I would have a hard time doing my job as a creative person if I thought people were going to see all the stuff that happens between when I start and when it ships. Yeah. We just want to show the thing that shipped. We might show some stuff like peek behind the curtain, here's how this thing developed, and yes, you miss out on like some of the true story of like how that thing happened. But like,
art of books are highly curated. The art of books is not actually all the art. It's as
not by a long shot.
But I mean, it's very. They're picking the best stuff, and the appropriate stuff, and
then picking the story that they want to tell with how the art went and all that. And those are also products, as it turns out, right? So it's like. But yeah, it would be very hard for me. Like, I think about people who live stream development and things like that. And I'm like, oh, wow, I could never do that. Like, I mean, first of all, I don't know. It's just, we just have a hard time doing that. Like, I couldn't do the performative aspect, I think, because of how my brain has to work while I'm coding. But also just the, like, how many dead ends and like, I build how I work around being able to compile really fast. So I make tons of mistakes because I'm going to compile it a billion times instead of like making sure it's right the first time. I'm like, no, I'm going to use this tool for me. Like, and I wouldn't be able to work that way. I'd be embarrassed. But now of course I've admitted it on my podcast. So I guess everybody knows I'm a terrible programmer. Anyway, I did want to at least be careful about like, I didn't want to just let that word fly because I hear it a lot. When it doesn't apply. And so I want to pull that word out too. So
it's good.
Anyway, do you have further thoughts on that, or do you want to read our final, relatively short mail?
No, I think I've said everything.
Okay, cool.
Okay. So last mail, subject Phoenix Wright updates from Ben Zog. Wait, I messed it up. Zaug.
Oh, and in fact, it's in his PS.
I had it right.
Okay. You had it right, and then, it's because I already teased it for you. I threw it
somewhere in my subconscious
into conversation earlier, and I was like, "Oh, hopefully he'll pick that up." And then you did, and then you put it down.
Worked. Yep, that's me. Hey, DGC, just wanted to write an update. Here are some interesting things from the DS version or other info. You could yell objection or take that into your DS to use them in game. That's incredible.
That's hilarious. I love that.
I don't remember if you could get left and right in the text on DS, but I know you could keep looping it. You could go left, right.
Right in the
right in the back and forth on the cross examination. Yep. Looping's fine, but left and right's even better. Love it. And the attorney's badge is a Japanese thing that comes up again in the more recent game Judgment, a spinoff from Yakuza. I'm really interested in Judgment from what I've heard about it. I don't know if I'll ever get to it, but it sounds.
I find the Yakuza series itself kind of fascinating, and I've got a couple more that I own. I have like 1 or 0, I guess. I think it's 0 anyway, and 5. I think I have both of those, and I don't know, maybe someday when I'm streaming again, I will do that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in Yakuza too. I think Judgment is appealing to me because it's just started, and
Yeah.
Yakuza seems like
oh my God, trying to understand. I went to the Wikipedia page once on Yakuza and was like, I literally don't understand where the foothold is. Like, if I wanted to play these in order, what is it's all there, and I'm still like, I have no idea, because there's so many that are like remakes or remasters, and like, but then they have different titles. It's not just like Yakuza 1 remake. It's like Yakuza, and then a string of Japanese words that I don't understand, and it's like, the
numbers
that
are
cuts
not
through the moon or whatever, and you're like, what is that? What does that mean? Like, I just want to know, how many games are there, and what is the order to play them in? Yeah, that doesn't exist
not like
for that series. So Judgment is the place to jump in.
Yeah. The numbers are not useful in that series, it seems like.
They are not.
But of your little monologue you just had there, I mean, compared to Kingdom Hearts, I mean, come on, you've jumped into that, so you gotta.
But that's clear. I bought a thing with all the games in it in order.
Yeah, all right.
There's a menu. Play them in this order.
Yes, but there's a lot of buts. I feel like in there. There's something always comes up with like.
Oh man, I love
in
the
that
butts
series, or yeah. Anyway, all right. I'm final sentence here. Finally, the second game in the series has a very familiar first case as this one that is like a tutorial. However, for it to make sense, Phoenix gets amnesia. Yes. Awesome. That's so
every
great.
trope.
That's so great. Looking forward to hearing week 2, which hopefully you are doing right now, Ben. Ben from Iowa, Zaug. P.S. Thanks for correcting my name. But I am not bothered when you say it wrong, because even people in my hometown still do.
Well, so, I mean, the reason, Ben, is that even people I've known for 20 plus years still pronounce my name wrong. And it drives me crazy every time. Now, I realize in that case, it's on purpose.
Yeah, I'm embracing it at this point. I think my first intro for you embraced it. So, and for anyone who's watched us play classic World of Warcraft, it's right in.
Oh, that's
in
true.
my character's name,
right there in his character's name. The jerk.
Brilliant. That's it, folks.
Finally, at the end of the feedback. Thank you for all of that. I appreciate the continuing discussion of the cultural issues. But I don't know how much we'll discuss them in the future. But thanks for your additional feedback, and it's worth discussing it more, and like where our perspective is as well, so you kind of know where we come from on that. Thanks again for those emails sent to devgameclub@gmail.com, and for reviews. Thanks for forwarding that all in, Sam Spot, so that I had it. You can find us on the web at devgameclub.com, or on Twitter at devgameclub, where you can also find my co-host at...
Sorry to interrupt, but I have a thing I forgot to mention.
Oh, and there it is. It's at the end of my list of things. That was the wrong place to put it. I'm just going to rewind.
Yeah, no. Sorry.
You were going to say?
I was going to say. So for anyone who donated... So when I was going to go on my Pacific Crest Trail trip, as anyone who has been listening consistently knows all the history of that, so I won't repeat all of that stuff, but I did not go on that trip. Thus, the pledge drive for donations to charity did not happen because I did not go on that trip, though it is very gracious of everyone who donated, and we definitely had some one-time donations that did not apply to the pledge, so technically those could have gone through. But what I decided to do was actually essentially cancel that pledge out, and I have relaunched the webpage, allthosewhowander.org. And I have a short trip that I need to tell Brett about coming up that is hashtag recreate responsibly, which is a whole sort of like how to essentially go into the wilderness during COVID. So I designed a trip to abide by those guidelines from our public agencies. And so it's a very short trip compared to the PCT, but I am going to do it as a sort of micro version. And I am going to put up another pledge drive for Big City Mountaineers specifically to donate to. So I had a good chunk of people who donated to that previous one. Your pledges will not go through. But if you are interested in pledging again for a shorter trip, I will go to that website and I will sort of plug it in the next couple episodes. So I'm relaunching the site for a new trip. Still same concept though. I hike, you pledge, and then we donate.
Okay. And that website is again?
allthosewhowander.org. Okay.
All right. Thanks very much. In that case, our website is devgameclub.com. You can find us on Twitter at devgameclub, where you can also find my co-host at
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end.
I was up till, I don't know, a couple weeks ago streaming on twitch.tv/Brett Duvel. I've been having a health issue with my eyes and eye strain and headaches and vertigo and all kinds of fun stuff. So look forward to that again someday, I hope. Our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton and commissioned by friend of the cast, Aaron Evers. Have fun handling the truth if you can this week, and good night.
Good night.